As more and more immigrants began to enter the United States, they would need work to support themselves and their families. The West was experiencing tremendous expansion, and the Industrial Revolution was booming. This led many immigrants to go down west and to begin working on the farms or even the factories. However, working conditions, especially in the factories, were terrible, and the wages they received were ridiculously low.
Strikes and boycotts began taking place in order to try and change the way they were treated, but to no effect. People like Thomas Nast used political cartoons in order to criticize the government of their failure to take action. Someone who helped struggling immigrants and other people was Jane Addams. She acted as a social worker to help the struggling people. She earned the nickname of Saint Jane.
The unjust treatments of workers led to the creation of unions. Most unions, however, just called for the raising of the workers' wages. However, unions such as the American Federation of Labor in 1866 and later the Knights of Labor in the 1880s emphasized a bigger idea. The Knights of Labor were a radical and inclusive group and came before the American Federation of Labor. The Knights of Labor, officially the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor, was the largest and one of the most important American labor organizations of the 1880s. The Knights promoted the social and cultural uplift of the working man, rejected socialism and anarchism, and demanded the 8-hour day, and promoted the producers' ethic of republicanism. In some cases, it acted as a labor union, negotiating with employers, but it was never well organized, and after a rapid expansion in the mid-1880s, it suddenly lost its new members and became a small operation again. The American Federation of Labor was a very modern and exclusive group, only taking in skilled white workers, which made negotiating very easy for them. The American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, was a national federation of labor unions in the United States. It was founded in Columbus, Ohio, in May 1886 by an alliance of craft unions disaffected from the Knights of Labor, a national labor association. The National Ladies Government Workers Union was once one of the largest labor unions in the United States, one of the first U.S. unions to have a primarily female membership, and was a key player in the labor history of the 1920s and 30s. The union also became more involved in electoral politics, in part as a result of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire on March 25, 1911, in which 146 shirtwaist makers, most of them young immigrant women, either died in the fire that broke out on the 8th floor of the factory or jumped to their deaths. Many of these workers were unable to escape because the doors on the floor had been locked to prevent them from stealing or taking unauthorized breaks. The fire led to legislation requiring improved factory safety standards and helped spur the growth of the International Ladies Government Workers Union, which fought for better working conditions for sweatshop workers. These unions focused on the commonwealth of the people. The Hartford Courant of December 13, 1901, stated, "That legislation be petitioned to enact a law to cover all dangerous parts, amicable settlement, and enforce the 8-hour law on all government work." This example shows how the Knights of Labor looked out for the interests of their employees, and they were not greedy or taking advantage of them. By doing so, they gave the workers higher hopes. The Knights of Labor was a larger organization which helped organize craft unions into a federation where the individual union kept some autonomy. They would soon absorb the American Federation of Labor. The Hartford Courant of December 16, 1889 stated that in turn, the American Federation of Labor and affiliated trade unions will become members of the mixed assemblies of the Knights of Labor. This was an example of unions joining together in order to gain more power in their fight for the workers' rights. Okay. Many years later, the National Labor Relations Act was passed by Congress, and it was in order to encourage collective bargaining. Collective bargaining was a way to replace labor unions because the employer would have to discuss work conditions with their employees.
Around the time of the forming unions, the farmers were struggling to support themselves and their families as the economic changes began to turn against them. The farmers began to see how they could use unions in order to solve their own problems. They were drawn into the unions by the same factors which drew the industrial laborers to labor unions. Power was found in corporations. The biggest concerns for the farmers were the ridiculous railroad prices. Railroads were the most reliable transportation systems in the country, and it was due to the railroads that the expansion of the West was ever possible. The unchecked power of the railroads and grain elevators led to them being abused, which led to the farmers calling for regulations. This began the Granger movement. According to the Hartford Courant of December 6, 1970,
a campaign for state control of railroads and grain elevators, carried on during the 1870s by members of the Patrons of Husbandry, a farmers' organization that had been formed for social and cultural purposes. From this information, it is clear to see what the Granger movement was all about. The farmers formed a union known as the Grange in order to push for state control of the railroads. The members were also known as Grangers, and they were farmers who fought against individual grain transportation practices and the unregulated railroad practices. This led to the regulating of railroad practices in the Midwestern states of Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, also known as the Granger states, in the late 1860s. At this time, just as today, the states each had their own legislatures. The Grangers used a voting bloc to elect their members into these legislatures into the Granger states. According to Wikipedia, a voting bloc is a group of voters that are strongly motivated by a specific concern. The Grangers used this type of voting in order to allow members to get into the state legislatures and help support railroad reforms. This led to the passing of the Granger Laws, which were a series of laws put into effect in the Granger states, establishing public relations of railroad rates and operating practices. These laws did not make the railroad corporations happy because they believed they were being cheated, so they filed lawsuits in hope to gain back control. The view on whether the states had the power to regulate the railroads was the center of the Supreme Court case, Munn v. Illinois in 1877. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the court upheld the state's power to regulate private industries. But this triumph was short-lived for the Grangers because just 9 years later, in the court case known as the Wabash v. Illinois, the court ruled that the federal government itself, and not the states, had the power to control interstate commerce. The case developed as a result of the Illinois legislatures responding in 1871 to pressure from the National Grange, an association of farmers, by setting maximum rates that private companies could charge for the storage and transport of agricultural products. The Chicago grain warehouse firm of Munn and Scott was subsequently found guilty of violating the law, but appealed the conviction on the grounds that the Illinois regulation represented an unconstitutional deprivation of property without due process of law. This decision led to the creation of the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, which regulated the railroad industry, particularly its monopolistic practices. The act required the railroad practices be reasonable and just, but it did not give the government power to fix specific rates. Then, in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, and its purpose was to curb concentrations of power that interfere with trade and reduce economic competition. As put by Wikipedia, the law attempts to prevent the artificial raising of prices by restriction of trade or supply, but it has sometimes been said that the purpose of the Sherman Act is not to protect competitors, but rather to protect competition, as well as promote and preserve a competitive landscape. There is no doubt that the Industrial Revolution was one of the most influential time periods of human history. It was almost solely responsible for propelling society into the modern economies that we still have in place today. The technological advances of this time are what allowed for the mass production of goods and services for society, which allowed trade to be conducted on a much larger scale. Additionally, the average family saw an increase in the amount of income that they received because an unskilled worker could find work in one of the many new factories that were opened. Unfortunately, the workers of the time were usually taken advantage of because of their apparent lack of skill and the abundance of workers available for the same jobs. This created a work environment especially negative for women, who could be treated unfairly in the workplace and would receive less pay for the work they did. Prompted by the oppression that many in the working class felt, unions were formed to protect workers' freedoms and safety. Unions such as the Knights of Labor and American Federation of Labor and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union appeared, as did legislature, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act. The Industrial Revolution jolted us into the modern era, and without it, our world would be unrecognizable.